Thanks for coming along to this session on everybody's favorite topic, user profile sync. We've only got an hour. Could be entertaining. Skip this, don't care about that. So, it's very difficult to do this topic in an hour. There's quite a lot to cover, so I probably will skip through the slides very quickly so that we can get to a demonstration, which is, the more interesting parts of this content. You might have seen some of this content before. Indeed, there are lots of things with user profile synchronization in the product that are more or less exactly the same as what we had in the previous version. So if you do have familiarity with that, a lot of this will be comfortable for you. So we'll talk a little bit about the practice discipline of identity management and its importance in this space. It's true across all of SharePoint, but it probably has the most touch points with respect to user profile sync. Then we'll look briefly at the architecture, very high level, talk through some provisioning considerations. Then we'll spend most of the time talking about a new capability. It's not really new. This conference is called SharePoint Evolution, but we're kind of going back to the future here with a thing called Active Directory Import. We'll cover user profile sync as well, and I'll also touch on the third option, External Identity Manager, towards the end, but we don't have time to cover that one in depth in this session. So as far as identity management is concerned, talking more to the practice discipline aspects here, or the business aspects, user profiles in SharePoint have increased in importance, on every release, and we've now got to a point where fundamentally large chunks of the product simply do not work and will not function if you don't have user profiles. Now, to what degree we need that data to be complete is going to be very, customer or scenario specific. But with every release, and we should expect this to continue going forward, user profiles or the user profile data is considered a core infrastructure enabler for other aspects of the product. And what that means is anytime we are doing SharePoint 2013 deployments, that means we have to be in the identity management world, and we have to deal with the variety of problems in this space. And most of us are probably not identity management consultants or identity management experts, whatever. We're more SharePoint in our kind of specialism. So that's can be painful, especially when dealing with the larger organizations. Pretty much all of the features in the product that are either new or have had significant investment this time around rely on profiles. And there's some examples on the slide here. We've got the SharePoint app model. It performs authorization decisions by rehydrating the user object effectively, and that requires a user profile to be present. Doesn't mean we care what the telephone number or the manager of that user is, but it means there must be a user profile. Anytime we do server-to-server authentication for talking to Azure Workflow Manager, any other number of examples, if we're using e-discovery, those kind of things, will require similarly a profile to be present. And therefore, in situations where in the past we might have not been too concerned about these things, and probably in some cases not even deployed the user profile service application at all, we can no longer kind of have that option. We effectively need user profiles, should be considered a core service application in the farm. On the other side of this, from a non-technical perspective, the fundamental reality of identity management is technology is a tiny piece of the space, a tiny piece of the problem. 10% is probably a overestimation. Everything else in identity management is completely nothing to do with technology. It's politics, ownership, and those kind of things. So this is very important to understand from the start of a project rather than kind of discovering it as you go along through the project delivery. So the main things that we need to think about, and I'm not going to cover all of them, but the four ones that are the most prevalent and the most common are in these areas. The first area is around data ownership. So if we consider a simple example of a company who have personnel IDs for each employee, generally that information, that data is going to be controlled and managed, owned by the HR department. So there's going to need to be a dialogue with those guys to understand which systems are allowed to change it, if any, how we go about doing that, what type of information system is running behind the scenes, And this does vary, greatly across different organizations. Some organizations are very kind of old-fashioned and have silos of data ownership. Other organizations are much more kind of laissez-faire about it, and they're not really too worried, and they're more sort of open and transparent. So it is driven to a large degree by the culture of the organization. It might also be driven by other aspects, such as is the company an operating model? In other words, do they have many different subsidiaries around the world, and they all have different considerations in this respect? Once we've figured out who actually looks after the data, who has ownership of it, we need to worry about the quality of the data. So if we're importing various attributes of users and then making decisions based on that data within our applications, it's only going to ever be as good as the data quality of the source system. In a lot of cases, in my projects, this is the biggest problem. Because generally the Active Directory infrastructure has grown organically over many years. It's generally looked after by an outsourced service provider, so the end customer doesn't have direct access to it. And that company wants to implement like a people directory, people search, white pages, those kind of things. And this will fail miserably in that situation until some form of data completion and cleansing activity takes place. It's not just a question of making sure you have data, but the data has to be up to date and accurate. And so that ties into the next option, which is getting more towards the technical side again in terms of the health of the systems we're talking to. One of the biggest reasons profile import is slow, regardless of the version of SharePoint you're running, is the health of the systems you're connecting to. Sometimes these are out of our control. They're not in scope for the project, or it might be or viewed as being too expensive and too risky to fix them, but we hit these problems very commonly when working with large-scale deployments. Similarly, if we're using a line of business application to feed user profiles, we need to worry about the availability and performance of the external system we're talking to. And then from a security or really an authorization perspective, we need to think about how we're going to control access to all of these different systems, what permissions are necessary, are there any regulatory concerns that we need to deal with or take into account, and also understand fundamentally what we're doing here is passing personally identifiable information over the wire from the source systems to the SharePoint environment. So for most organizations, they have really very strong legal obligations to protect that data. And you can protect it in a number of ways in terms of what you allow, what types of data you might allow to be exposed. So a good example is a date of birth, right? Most organizations, it's acceptable to have the birthday, but you're not going to include the birth year to protect that. But regardless of those kind of things, the rest of the information is still personally identifiable, and therefore it should be encrypted over the wire. So again, these aren't the only considerations here, they're just the most common. SharePoint projects are a little bit Groundhog Day in this respect because pretty much, well, there is no SharePoint project that I've worked on ever that hasn't had these issues. And the sad reality is that they usually only come to light, once the project is already underway, maybe a couple of months into the project. And really they need to be dealt with right at the start of the project because you can't plan out delivery timeframes when you don't know some of these things because you don't know how long it's going to take to fix. From a user profile sync perspective, independent of those considerations, we really need to be friendly with our directory service administrators. Is there anybody here who looks after Active Directory for their organization? A few of you, yeah. How many of you look after all of the stuff? So SharePoint, AD, SQL, everything. Yeah, a few of you. So you guys have got it lucky, right? You can be friendly with yourself. You can ask for a change to be made. You know it's going to happen reasonably quickly. But if you're not in that situation, you've got to ask somebody else to make the change. In a lot of cases, you're probably going to have to tell them what it is you want doing and then explain where and how to do it for some of our prerequisites. But we also need to understand, when things like the domain controllers are going to be rebooted, when they're being patched, because if we're running a sync when that happens, obviously we're going to get a negative impact to the SharePoint farm, but also we could be marking profiles for deletion, which means they'll then be removed completely from our store. On the previous slide, we were talking about data cleansing. In most cases, the output of that project is some form of bulk update. And again, we don't want to be doing an import on SharePoint when that bulk update is occurring. So it's all about planning, keeping in regular contact with the administrators of the external systems we're reliant upon. It seems fairly obvious. It is obvious, but that doesn't mean it's not a very common challenge for SharePoint delivery. And it's really more about what happens after the project is finished and the farm is in production usage, not just the initial deployment phases. Interesting mistake on the slide there at the bottom. I've done a copy and paste error. But we also need to bear in mind that we have change control potentially to worry about. So we need to plan out if it's going to take 3 weeks to get replicating directory changes permission set for us. Obviously, that's going to impact our initial first full import, the thing that usually takes a long time anyway, and therefore is going to negatively impact the overall perception of the system. Or it might delay future work that we do, testing and so forth. So let's now focus back on the SharePoint specifics, talk about fundamentally what's been learned over the last few years from the perspective of Sync, and then think about what Microsoft have decided to do about it, if anything, to help us going forward. So the main lessons from the previous release, all comedy aside, is the real problem was the first one here, inadequate understanding of the architecture of the overall subsystem. That led to numerous problems. This is not just applying to us as SharePoint practitioners in the field, but also to the product group who build the product, right? It's not an us and them situation, it's both of us. So this is easily the most common cause of a weak deployment or one that has operational problems, and upgrade aggravation and so on. We have to understand that the features and design constraints of the UPA drive how we can deploy it and how we might need to tune it for better performance, better throughput. Was anybody in the Service App Federation talk yesterday? A few of you. So I'll recap that in a hopefully short space of time. We can do lots of interesting things with publishing of service applications. Gives us great flexibility for deployment until we start talking about the user profile service application. And that's an example where the constraints or the design constraints of the UPA mean we are more limited. And so this is very important, especially if we have a geographically dispersed environment of more than one farm. We need to think about how we're going to have the profile data in each farm. Then a lack of planning. The vast majority of customers will take the default profile property mappings that ship with the product and perform sync operations, and then realize that wasn't the data they quite wanted, go back through the process probably 3 or 4 times before they get to where they need to be. And that's just getting the information in. Then we need to think about privacy levels and so forth. So in most of the reactive work I've done where I've helped customers who've had problems or challenges, you go and you review the deployment, you interview them and so forth. This is usually the #1 area that's sort of a bit more fluffy, a bit less technical. And we also, of course, need to think about the supporting infrastructure and related service applications in SharePoint that interact with user profiles in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, SQL Server. The single best thing you can do to improve sync time when you're using user profile sync is to move the profile-related databases away from the content databases. In other words, deploy more SQL Server to enable them to get the throughput you need. Similarly, we've got search for people search, managed metadata for taxonomic properties, and BDC for speaking to external line of business systems. New guy in the play this time around is the distributed cache. This is pretty important to us across the product, but with user profiles, a small amount of social data is in play here, which isn't directly related to profile sync, but is related to UPA. So it's important to tune all of these things as well. Unfortunately, we can't treat this in isolation. So based on those things, the product group kind of got their heads together and came up with some goals going forward to try and address some of the customer pain. And these were in the 3 areas of performance, reliability, and compatibility. And you might think these aren't very, they're not very aggressive. They're not doesn't include any, new features with shiny bells and whistles and so forth, but they are incredibly important. Obviously, the performance of the initial full sync or full import is hugely important to project delivery. If it's going to take 2 or 3 weeks to import 250,000 user profiles, that's a problem, right? So the idea here is to be able to decrease the time significantly from, less than a weekend, ideally, for, the canonical large organization that has a couple of 100,000 user profiles. We also want to have better insight from the perspective of the people operating the farm to understand how it's performing, when it's failing, why it's failing, so have better instrumentation to allow us to make the right decisions when we're running the farm. And then the last one, compatibility, is really to do those two things without losing anything we had in SharePoint 2010. And broadly, that means we're not going to support less systems than we did before. And unfortunately, in that respect, right now, that goal hasn't actually been met. So today, with SharePoint 2010, if we want to import profiles from Active Adam, what's it now called, AD, Lightweight Directory Services, we have to use a sneakernet synchronization by exporting the directory to a file, copying it onto the SharePoint server, and fiddling around inside the Forefront Identity Manager product. That's what Microsoft called a serviceable workaround, and what I call a right horrible mess. But there are a lot of customers that need to do that. And unfortunately, right now, today, with SharePoint 2013, that is not supported, purely because we haven't had time to test it enough to be able to have confidence in the support statement. So in that respect, the compatibility goal hasn't been met. But otherwise, we have the same capability. Indeed, we have much broader capability now than we had before. So they're not very, exciting, but they are obviously very important. So in order to meet those goals, we've now got effectively 3 different modes of synchronization, and only 2 of them, or 1 of them really, does synchronization, but it's still called sync. So the first one is Active Directory import. This is the Back to the Future thing. It's very similar to what we had in SharePoint 2003 and 2007, whereby we can import only from Active Directory domains. It's very lightweight, it's very fast, it's very easy to configure. But it doesn't have the full functionality that we had previously in SharePoint 2010, which is user profile sync. That still exists. It's still effectively the same. It's a cut-down version of Forefront Identity Manager that's bundled with SharePoint. This is the thing that everybody got stuck on starting. Anybody here get stuck on starting? Okay, well, there's a few people not putting their hands up. I'm not sure I believe that. But anyway, this guy's still around. It's basically exactly the same as we had before, but under the hood has been improved quite considerably in terms of performance and reliability. But it is really no different. If we couldn't do something with it in 2010, we won't be able to do it so with SharePoint 2013. Then we have a new option, which is sort of new because it was always there in the product last time around but wasn't supported, called External Identity Manager. And this allows us to use either custom code or an external identity management product, such as the one from Microsoft, which is the full-fat Forefront Identity Manager as a separate deployment to allow us to do real identity management solutions, full synchronization, and so on. So this slide basically just has the same things in pictorial format. We've obviously got a SharePoint farm, and then on the right-hand side, we have 3 different types of source system. AD import can import only. UPS can do import and export to AD, can do import from BCS, and also import and export to 3 other LDAP directory systems that we support. Then we have the External Identity Manager using a thing called the SharePoint connector, which allows us to do full sync to all the different systems. But there's quite a lot of work involved in configuring this. You need to kind of be a FIM expert to make this light up. And we're going to focus today on the 2 that are highlighted there, ADI and UPS. I do have one slide on the External Identity Manager towards the end. In terms of provisioning these guys, so in other words, getting the UPA created and starting the service instances and so on, we have exactly the same, there is no change here from SharePoint 2010. So hopefully we're going to use the farm configuration wizard to make things work. Hopefully not, that's a disaster. You really don't want to use that option, but we can use the UI for your managed service applications, create the UPA, go ahead and start the service instances. But in the reality, for most deployments, we're going to want to automate or improve our productivity in terms of the amount of time it takes to create farms and so on, leveraging Windows PowerShell. And unfortunately, the schema issue with this still remains the same, and a choice was made not to fix this bug. And what this bug is all about, in essence, is if you're running the PowerShell session as any other user than the farm account, so you're not logged on as the farm account, which you shouldn't be because that's a very bad idea, we will make the databases in an incorrect fashion with the wrong schema, and then we will never be able to start UPS unless we fix this problem. So there's a couple of workarounds, well, there's 3 workarounds. Originally, it was suggested that you just log on as the farm account, run the PowerShell, which will work, but you don't want to get into the habit of doing that. And we could also go into SQL Server and just change the thing that's set incorrectly, which officially is unsupported. And again, it's not something we want to be in the habit of doing. It's dangerous to have end customers doing that type of modification. So the workaround is really to leverage non-SharePoint commandlets, so Windows Server commandlets, which allow us to effectively simulate what would be the behavior of central admin, but this time from PowerShell. Now, both of these will work. The first one works only if user account control is disabled on the server. The second one will work in both scenarios, whether it's enabled or not. So really the guidance here is to just use the second option because it doesn't matter then if user account control is enabled or not. And the net effect of this is that they're just going to simulate logging on as the farm account. So we do require log on locally for the farm account on the machine, but we're going to need that anyway later on to get the service instance running, so that's not a big concern. We also need it for regular farm operations. And both require local administrator rights. That should be obvious. If we're going to request via UAC to elevate our permission set on the machine, we obviously need to be an administrator to do that. And again, I'm sorry? Yes. Yes, we must have the secondary logon service running. And the other thing about this, again, this shouldn't be too big of a consideration because, again, to start the service instance later on, we need to be an administrator as well. So we're not losing anything here. It's not sort of undoing our security posture, if you like, for the environment. And we can always remove it after the fact, after it's created. So this is the solution. I'll show you this in the demonstration. But basically what we have is an external script file, and then we call this file from another one. So the important part here is the highlighted section. There's no difference here for what we would do normally. It's just that we have it defined in a file that we save somewhere, and then we execute it by initiating its execution from another script. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm grabbing the credentials of the farm account. I'm going to prompt the user for the password, and then I'll kick off a new process under UAC elevation. And that avoids the problem, allows us to use PowerShell to provision the UPA without then having impact later on. So let's take a quick look at this. It's not very exciting. It's very difficult to make PowerShell exciting. I have a very simple environment on this machine, 3 servers, so a domain controller, a SQL server, and obviously a SharePoint server. I've got about 1,700 users in my Active Directory. I've also, ahead of time, wait for this to wake up, I've provisioned the Managed Metadata service, and this is not relevant to provisioning of UPA, but it will be important later on when we perform an import. So we just need to wait for this guy to warm up. Yep.
Could you provide us with scripts?
Yeah, these scripts are all available on my website. I will also give them for the conference DVD as well. Yeah. So you can see here I don't have a user profile service application at the moment, but I do have an MMS, and this is the default sort of configuration of the managed metadata service. I haven't done anything else to it, but you will note we already have, by default here, a people term group, and within there we have 3 term sets. And those are, if you remember SharePoint 2010, if you didn't configure this, you would get a bunch of red warnings when you're trying to edit profiles and so on. So this has actually, to a certain degree, been pre-configured for us. And that's an important thing to understand because it will impact the time it takes to do an import. We'll see that a little later on. But otherwise, everything is kind of in its default settings at this stage. Now, the first thing I need to do is make sure that my farm account is a local admin, which is one of the good things about this top health analyzer rule thing, right? Most of these just annoy you, right? They just change the color of the front page of central admin, and a lot of them are reporting misconfiguration, which is actually how it should be. So you always know your farm's in a good state if you see the yellow warning. But in this particular case, this top one is actually useful to us because if this guy doesn't generate a warning, we shouldn't continue to the next step because it doesn't matter, it's not going to work. So especially if you're doing it for somebody else's environment, this is quite useful to us. So I don't have a warning at the moment, hopefully. I've got no warnings here. So if I attempt to run my scripts, they will fail. First thing I'm going to do, though, is start the user profile service instance. So this isn't the sync service instance. This is just the user profile service instance. Very simple, just do start service instance. And if you do it in this order, you can hopefully avoid the requirement to do like IIS resets as you walk through the process. Not going to guarantee you don't need to do an IIS reset because it is SharePoint after all, but it will avoid most of them. And it's at this stage where I need to do the local administrator thing. So here, just to show you the script, it's get rid of this, make it a bit bigger. This is exactly the same as the one that I had on the slide. The only difference is I'm configuring the my site host in here somewhere as well when I create the service application. But otherwise, it's identical. But I'm not running this file. I'm calling it from this guy, which has a reference to it. So at the moment, my account isn't in the local admins. I'm going to run this commandlet here. Oh, it's already in there. It's interesting. Let me double check that. Okay, it's already in there, good. But I need to remember to restart the timer service after I make this change in order for that SID to be applied to the farm account. So I can't just add it, I need to restart a service that runs as that account in order for the change to make effect. And if we come back over here and run that rule, it'll generate a warning. So it's a useful tip, just use that to verify that the configuration is correct, especially if you don't have the necessary permissions on the machine to make the change. So when this is finished, it takes a few moments. You can see I've got the warning now. I won't bother going in, but it would be the same rule that I just ran, obviously. So now I can go ahead and run this file, or this script, I should say. It's going to prompt me for the password. And then it brings up a new process, and then it's going to prompt me for UAC elevation. Now, if I don't see this dialog, and I see the previous dialog again, in other words, I see 2 password prompts, that means that the farm account isn't in the local admins group. Okay? Because that guy's not an administrator, it can't even spawn this process, the consent.exe. So I'm going to choose yes. That'll open another PowerShell process, and in a few moments it'll create the UPA, and it'll just output the properties of the UPA, and just so that we can be sure that it did something. So it's pretty heinous, but it's really all, it's the only thing we can do other than logging on interactively as the farm account. So it's not very pretty, but it works. It's good enough. We can bake this into our provisioning scripts or our automated build tools to have a reliable, repeatable process. assuming it works. There you go, we're good. So if we come back over to Central Admin Managed Service Apps, we should see the UPA now created. And depending on how long the sort of lag is between the point at which it's finished and you're attempting to manage it, you should be able to get into the management of the UPA without having to restart IIS here. And we need to do an IIS because it's not long enough. Now, this just helps to force it. In most cases, if you just walk away from the keyboard for a few minutes, 5 minutes, go have a coffee or something, then it will be fine. But in order to kind of ensure that everything is good for the next step and we want it to happen immediately, then an IIS reset will do that for us. But it does make for delays, of course, in these type of demonstrations. Anyway, we'll assume that worked, which is pretty dangerous. I'll flip back to the slides for a moment to talk about AD import. Okay, so this is the new capability, and it is already having a very positive impact on customer deployments. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to stick to using this for the long haul, but it's a great way of getting up and running quickly. That's the fundamental goal of this feature. The idea, again, is for the most common customer deployment scenario, which is Active Directory, is to enable us to get the input, the information, the initial information into SharePoint quickly and easily. But it is import only. We can't use this to export properties to AD attributes, and it is Active Directory only. You can actually use this to speak to another LDAP system, but that is not supported. It always imports users and groups. We don't have the ability to turn off group import. We have a similar container selection capability that we had in UPS, but we also have the ability to constrain the type of objects we're importing using LDAP query filters. These filters are inclusion-based, so that's the opposite way to UPS, which are exclusion-based. That's quite important to understand when planning the filters. And we support more than one domain, but what that means is for each domain, we need a connection. So if you have 20 domains, you're going to have to manage 20 connections and 20 sets of property mappings. So bear that in mind. The difference here is in UPS, it's forest-based, so we only need a connection per forest. We can also support secondary accounts or shadow accounts, as long as they are mapped correctly with the source DN attribute. We simply create connection to both, and it will work just fine. We can do custom property mappings, and we can connect to the Active Directory using the same authentication mechanisms we could in the past. So that's either Windows authentication, which is the most common, Forms authentication, which doesn't exist and is actually an LDAP bind, but in the UI we call it forms-based authentication for some reason, and then we can use trusted identity provider like ADFS or whatever else we've had installed in the farm. There are some limitations, though. The first one is not really that important, but we're not going to, because we're domain-based, that's the nature of system directory services, the APIs that this guy uses, we're not going to resolve contact objects across the forest. We cannot map the SharePoint system out-of-the-box profile properties. So all of the ones that start with SPS hyphen, we can't map to those. We can't augment profiles from BDC. We can't import profile pictures, right? So we can only import the URL, the thumbnail URL, but we can't import the binary data. So that's a pretty big limitation. We can't do funky hacks with multi-value attributes mapped to a single value property and vice versa. You might be wondering why would anybody do that, but it was a pretty common customer configuration. Similarly, we can't have two different attributes going to the same property. Neither of those are a good idea. So we just don't allow them in Active Directory import mode. We still need the replicating directory changes permission. This is a good thing. The reason we need this permission is to enable the system to use the Active Directory changelog. If we didn't use it, we'd have to figure out some other way to prevent us grabbing all of the data, even though we've got most of it already in the system and it hasn't changed. So we still require this permission set in Active Directory. It just won't work without it. Similarly, if we're going to consider later on moving to the user profile sync option, once we've got the initial import done, we also need to still configure NetBIOS domain names enabled to ensure that the display name in the welcome menu and so forth is correctly displayed and formatted. So the recommendation here is, again, this is similar to the schema fix. If our names do match, then this doesn't matter. It doesn't have any effect. So we should just be doing it all the time. And sadly, there's still no UI for this. We still need to run this PowerShell snippet to set the property and then update the profile service application. It's very important to understand you need to do this before you create a connection. So the best way to do this, to approach this, is to just always set it immediately after you create the UPA. That guarantees you're in a good state. So how do we enable it? Well, it's fairly straightforward, but out of the box, what we've just done on my demo machine is provision the UPA. We're still going to be stuck in the UPS default state. So we need to go turn this on effectively, change the option. So we can do it in the central admin, which is this second option here in the middle screenshot where we select to use SharePoint Active Directory Import, or we can do a similar thing with this fantastic double negative property here called no ILM used, and we can set that to be true, and that will set us into the Active Directory Import mode. Obviously, an engineer named that property, and probably one straight out of college, but never mind. That's what it is. That's the one we need to use. And again, remember to update the property, update the UPA state after doing that. Also, to bear in mind, the good thing about this is if you're going to stick with AD import, once you've done that change, you don't need to ever start the UPS service instance. So you're not going to get stuck on starting. You don't need to worry about this. But watch out, because the central admin UI is sometimes unaware that the property has changed and therefore presents you a UI suggesting that you should go and start the service instance. But you don't need to. Again, this is one of these situations where it's not behaving as expected. It's not kind of quick enough, so the best approach is to just kind of chill out a little bit, walk away, have a coffee, come back, try again, and it will be working. So just be aware that the UI can be misleading. Again, it's another symptom of reusing the same modular UI framework for lots of different things that are kind of are not really suitable for that type of implementation. So we'll have a sync database, but it's going to be sat there empty. And we don't care about this, but we also don't need to worry about providing disaster recovery for an empty database, right? So it's no longer a pain point when we're trying to design either high availability, redundancy, or disaster recovery options, because it is supported to logship or mirror an empty database. Not that there's any point in doing that. So in other words, the database needs to be there because the UPA expects it, but otherwise it's ignored. Scripting of sync connections. So this is something we can't do in SharePoint 2010, and we still can't do with UPS, but if we are using Active Directory Import, we are supported to try and use the SP profile sync connection commandlets. So that's kind of useful to us if we're doing automated build scripts. But bear in mind, there is a bit of a minor flaw in the remove SP profile sync connection, because it doesn't actually remove the connection, it just removes an OU from the connection. So that's a bug that is actually being investigated for a future resolution. But at the moment, the workaround's on the slide there. And unfortunately, what that will do is it will delete all the connections. Obviously, you could change up the script to select one specifically. So just be aware that, whilst they are supported, that doesn't mean that they work, okay? LDAP query filters, we can go back to the way we used to do it in SharePoint 2003, 2007, by allowing us to constrain the selection of objects or include objects, either way around really, by using this very flexible old school LDAP query filter syntax. So that's a good thing because we have ultimate power, But because we have that power, we also need to take a great deal of responsibility for what we use here. There's an awful lot of sample scripts out there, or sample queries, I should say, on the internet, which are extremely poor performing. A good example is doing import selection based on group membership, a very common customer requirement. We want to import all of the accounts except for people who are in such and such a group. Sounds like a good idea. It's certainly convenient because it means you don't need to do any corrective action or corrective measures on Active Directory. But when you do that, behind the scenes, the system has to explode or expand the group membership. So if you have a very large group, there's a pretty significant performance penalty. And that's why the Forefront Identity Manager product doesn't work that way. So you need to be a little bit careful and understand the performance impact to doing it. Also, check out the fantastic IntelliSense and color coding and validation that we have in this UI down here, because again, they're reusing this modular UI framework. It doesn't really matter what filter you use. You're never going to be able to see the real money on this filter, right? You're always going to see the little bit at the start, which is the type of object you're working with, and then you can't see the rest of it. So I would recommend you use ADSI edit to validate and author the filter. Then you know that it's working as expected, and obviously you copy and paste it in here. But remember, the samples on the internet, generally speaking, they do work, but will they scale? Will they perform? Will they impact the import time? Those kind of things. You have to test with a representative number of users. AD import operations, this is very important to understand, just like with UPS. Every time we add or remove an organizational unit from a connection, anytime we change the filter, anytime we change our property mappings, we must do a full import. And when we do a full import, we may be in a situation where there's some profiles that did not come from that import operation. And this is something we should have been doing in SharePoint 2010, but very few customers did, is every time you do a full import, we should check to see which profiles didn't come from that connection, and the PowerShell to do that is on the slide here. What this is going to do is give us two things. Again, this is kind of bad design in terms of the syntax, but the first commandlet here, where we get the service application and pass in the parameter get non-imported objects, will basically return us a list of all the profiles that exist that didn't come from the connection that's just had the full import run on it. So we can review that list of users, and we verify those. We don't want those profiles anymore. We run the second one, which then goes ahead and marks those profiles for deletion in the database. So this is an operational habit we need to get into. So let's have a quick look at this. Hopefully we will have enough time. Oh, it's still not working over here. That's not good. Let's try one more time. So you can see here that it's already it's in the default state, so profile sync is the option. What I'm going to do is go ahead and change that. So we'll go into synchronization settings. Here's where I'm going to choose Active Directory import. You'll notice as soon as I do that, it grays out the top two options and this one in the middle for BCS, because these are, we can't change this in AD import, and we can't use BCS. Click OK. And you'll note that down here now, it's updated this. But watch out for this guy, right? Because the default here is now every 5 minutes. So as soon as I create a connection, for 5 minutes after that time, it's going to go ahead and do a full import, which is probably not what you want, right? Because that very first time you're configuring this is not, you're not going to do it in 5 minutes, and you don't want that to kick off. And obviously, this is as a default operationally is probably not what you want as well. Now I'll go ahead and create a sync connection. Again, we're reusing the UI, but this screen is now slightly different. So I'll go ahead and just give it a name here. But we only now have one option in the combo box, which, from my point of view, my background is not in computer science. My background is in graphic design, and user interaction. So I don't like it when you use a combo box that has one option. But anyway, now I'm going to put in the domain name, and notice that this is a domain name, not a forest name. So that's another difference. We have the same authentication options here. I'm going to use the an account that I have created specifically for this, which is called SPUPS. I have the password. Now, this password is validated when we attempt to populate the containers later on. So I can go ahead and do that. Note here, we can select to use SSL, which I'd recommend for production environments. Here's a filter for disabled users. So this is quite nice. In the past, we had to do bit on equals to, and there was lots of pointing and clicking. Now we can just check this tick box, which remarkably, when I demoed this like for the first time in public at the SharePoint conference, I actually got a round of applause for that, which is pretty low expectations from the SharePoint owners. I mean, it was in America, so anyway. And then I've got my LDAP filter, so I'll come back to that in a second. I'm just going to go ahead and select an OU here called SharePoint Users. And if we flip to the domain controller, just have a quick look at that. In here, I have 4 sub-OUs. So I've got one here for Switzerland, one for the UK, one for Italy, and one for the United States. I've also got a group there called Fabricam Users. If we drill into this guy, some of these accounts are disabled. So these ones here are disabled, and a few in each OU are disabled. I've gone ahead and deleted all of the people in this OU, which is very pleasant when you get to do that. If only. And then the Fabricam users includes a combination of users from some of those other OUs in this group. So I've got a filter here, which is going to basically grab every user who isn't a member of that OU. So remember, I said that these filters are inclusion-based, but the way I've made it an exclusion filter is simply by adding this exclamation mark at the start, which effectively reverses the direction. Now, I'm using this on purpose, but this is an example of the type of filters out there on the internet that are very poor performing. So for a large deployment, you wouldn't want to do this type of approach. So I've already gone ahead and validated this, so I know it works. I'm going to pop it in here. It's going to save, and you see how quick that was? I can't even do my joke about the spinning logo because it's not talking to the FIM product, right? It's not talking to the user profile sync service, so it's very quick to save this. And I can just go now what's going to happen is in 5 minutes time it's going to attempt to kick off a full import, but it's not going to work because I haven't set replicating directory changes yet for that account. But it's not going to respect that. It's just going to keep trying every 5 minutes. And we would see in the ULS that it's requesting a thing called the DearSync control protocol, and that request would fail. And until I grant that user the permissions, it wouldn't work. To save a little bit of time here, I'm going to go ahead and grant that permission using the wizard. Even an AD admin needs a wizard. You should all be familiar with this. This is the fundamental prerequisite we need. It's this guy here. Finish that. Now I've used the wizard, but all that's doing is setting a property of the domain object. So if I go into my advanced features view, I can just set it in here as well. You can see that it's just one of the extended permissions here, about halfway down. But it doesn't matter which way you do it. You can do this in PowerShell as well if you like. That is a solid requirement. Also, at this stage, if you've had to ask somebody to do that for you, a good thing to do is to validate that. So I have a script here which I type in the account name that I'm interested in, and then the permission set. We just go ahead and run this. You'll see here that it outputs down the bottom. The bit in green is telling me I do have the permissions on the domain. That's the one I just set, but I don't have it on the configuration partition. For AD import, we don't need to do the second one. But if we later move to UPS, we would need it. Because my domain name is corp.contoso.com. That means the short name is corp. And as they don't match, I need that setting as well. But we should be good. I'm going to go ahead and attempt to start a full import here. So I used the breadcrumb to go back to the page I want to be. Make a shortcut there. And go ahead and start this. And I'll load up the ULS viewer so we can have a quick look at what's happening sort of behind the scenes here. Just filter this down a little bit, clean out some of the junk that we're not interested in. And you can see that it's already kicked off and it's starting to import profiles. And you can see, for each profile, we've effectively got user profile record of so-and-so was updated by, and then we have three exceptions. Because I've not changed any of the property mappings, right? These are the default property mappings, so some of these aren't working. But guess what? Is there any documentation about what the default property mappings are between AD import, UPS? No, that hasn't been documented. I've actually put the AD import ones on my blog, but it was interesting trying to find out that information because, well, nobody had it, so we had to do a bit of testing to produce that stuff. So watch out for that. Whilst this is running, if we go over to the Manage Metadata service and look at the term store, we will see some of the data is being pumped into one of the taxonomic properties. Oh, sorry, I went back to the wrong place. Come over here. Oh, that's nice. Not seen that for a while. But you can get rid of it. Awesome. Here we go. Excellent. It was just having a rest, basically. So here's my job title term set, and you can see it's already starting to pump data in there, right? So you have to plan this because, well, first of all, you might not want this behavior. I mean, you may do, but might not. And obviously, the more of these you have in AD, the more you're going to get in here, but it's going to impact that import time because it's not just going to the profile store, it's also punting some information into here via the server object model. And if we come back to the, if we come back to the profile service, you can see already I have 12,000 users, and I'm hitting F5 on the keyboard. You see the number increasing. Obviously, that's a lot faster than it would be with UPS, right? With no way we'd be able to do those type of numbers within 10 minutes or less I've been doing. And that includes the term store aspects and those exceptions that we saw in the ULS. If we tightened that up, got rid of those exceptions, it would be a little bit quicker. And it's not importing my disabled objects. It hasn't finished, but we should be good enough to go here to test this. If we have a look in our AD, what have we got here? We have a user that's disabled called Ruth Backer. So let's try and search for that user. And hopefully we won't find it. But there are some roofs, but not the one that was disabled, so we can, that works as expected. Similarly, let's check out the group membership of Fabricam users. Nellie Collins is in here. So no results there. So we could, I knew that filter was going to work. Obviously, it's not the first time I've done this, but it just proves that that capability is in here, and it's very simple, very straightforward. Haven't even bothered to start the user profile sync service yet, and it doesn't give us all the features that we might want, but it's getting us up and running quickly, and that's going to save us time because even if I do switch to UPS, it's not going to mean I have to wait a very long time to get those initial 2,000 odd users into the profile store. And I'm just going to, so it's actually finished now, and there's 1694. So that's roughly, if you exclude that the members of that group and the ones that are disabled, my total is 1712. It's about right. Okay, let's talk about user profile sync for a few minutes. I don't have time to show it. It's not very exciting. Basically, there's a bunch of improvements under the hood, some of which are also backported to SharePoint 2010. It's all in this space. It's all about reducing that full import time, again, from many weeks, or a few weeks, I should say, to more like a weekend. And the way it's done is not any one of these things individually, but by the combination of all of them improve the sync time. So we're not doing a bunch of SQL silliness that we used to do. We batch up BDC imports into 3 at a time instead of one at a time. We don't run Forefront Identity Manager sync runs that are unnecessary, so that simplifies the equation significantly. This one's actually been backported to SharePoint 2010. Also, we clean up after ourselves now. Again, this has been backported to SharePoint 2010. As long as you create the UPA after a certain cumulative update, we no longer retain a bunch of old rubbish in the content in the profile database and the sync database. And sometimes, if we're resolving objects across boundaries, such as across a domain, we're taking that out of SharePoint and moving it into Forefront Identity Manager, which is much better suited to that type of behavior. So there's no feature that we have a touch point to here, but they all combine together to improve the overall import time, or sync time, I should say. Here's an example of the provisioning stages. At the top there is the SharePoint 2010 experience, where we have these 6 stages, and we've effectively halved that in SharePoint 2013. And unfortunately, we have retained the rather unfortunate naming convention there of MOS-AD. So depending on where you live, you find that a little worrying. Anyway, as far as operations is concerned, nothing is different, right? It's exactly the same as what we had in SharePoint 2010 in terms of creating sync connections, starting the user profile sync service instance, doing our property mappings, and so on. Everything is identical. All the same caveats apply. Here's how we provision the user profile sync service instance with PowerShell. We don't have a commandlet for it. I don't know why. Well, I do know why, but I unfortunately can't tell that story. So we're using a little bit of funkiness here to replicate what central admin does when we hit start in services on server for the UPS. The only kind of downside to this is we require to pass in the password of the farm account in plain text, because that set synchronization machine method there on line 21 expects a plain text value for the most important credential in your entire farm. So in this particular example, I'm not storing the password in the file. I'm going to prompt the user for it, like I did on the previous script example, so that we're not storing it anywhere. Anyway, that's how we do it. It's fairly straightforward. It'll take 3 minutes. And if it's taking more than 3 minutes, something's gone wrong. We need to be a local admin, remember, for this as well. This is the same slide as we had for AD import. So again, if we're changing our sync connections in any way, we need to run a full import. And similarly, we should deal with the purging of non-imported objects, which is Microsoft speak for profiles that didn't come from this sync connection. So if I now went ahead on this demo machine, switched to UPS and ran another import, there'd be one user in the profile store that didn't come from my profile import. That'd be the administrator account. That one you probably don't care about, but if there are lots of test users in your environment, you want to make sure that's being cleaned up on a regular basis. So this is quite important. So I don't have time to demo that. What I would have done is basically start the service instance and switch to it and do another import. But I will show you one quick thing, which is very important to understand and not that well known. Let's go ahead and change to user profile sync. And go into services on server and go into this page. I'm going to enter my password in here. Now I've entered it in twice. It's the best feature in Windows Server 2012, sorry. That's not the right password, okay? That is not the farm account password on this box. Oh, well, it thinks it's fine, right? Because all that page does is check that the 2 times you entered it, it matches, right? It doesn't validate the password's correct. So this is going to fail because that's not the farm account password. And so now I've screwed over my farm, basically. I need to wait for this to not be stuck in starting and then try again, this time using the correct password. So in the ULS, it'll tell me that the credentials are invalid. But that's just an indication of the type of weirdness that comes about by using these type of UI dialogues. That page doesn't even validate the credentials, which is a pretty heinous mistake. And in fact, it's the #2 reason why people get stuck in starting. because you saw the password I used there. You'd be surprised how many farms use a password very similar to that one. Okay. So just watch out for that. That's another reason to use PowerShell for working with this system in general, because you can avoid those kind of problems, which are purely driven by the lack of investment in the user interface. Oh, we might actually be able to see this. Yeah, you can see it's failed here, and the reason it's failed is because of this step here. Anyway, running out of time. Let's do the last slides. Now, as far as switching modes is concerned, the intention is that you use AD import to get up and running, and then you might switch to UPS if you need the BCS augmentation, or you want to export profiles, data, or you want to import the picture, for example, of the user. So that's the idea. But you have to remember that the AD import, there isn't a SyncDB, so our connection is stored in the profile database for AD import. For UPS, it's stored in the SyncDB. So we're going to have to configure a new connection and mappings. But the idea is not that you then switch back to AD import a few months later, and then a couple of months after that, you go backwards and forwards, right? That's not the design intent. Unfortunately, some of the very early kind of like marketing material hinted that this is possible, but it's not a good idea. There's plenty of bugs in this world, so that's why it's in red. Basically, don't do it. The idea is use AD import to get up and running quickly, then move to UPS if you have a business requirement for it, and plan this stuff out. I mentioned this, the connections are stored in different places, so we don't migrate those automatically. There is no way to do that automatically. From a long-term perspective, I'm sure you've all enjoyed greatly the user experience from an as an administrator, all that pointing and clicking you do when you're configuring your property mappings, right? With the beautiful UI, you're going into a page, then doing this, removing things. It's horrible. So in terms of automating this, really the ideal world is to look at some form of XML provisioning approach. So you define the mappings in like Excel or something like that, and then you can suck up that information in a script and apply the changes through a custom solution rather than relying on the central administration user interface. You need to understand the design constraints here and document the configuration before you consider moving or switching modes. Also remember to review the non-imported objects, as I mentioned a couple of times now on previous slides. One last slide, really, or one last consideration before we get into the wrap-up is on the External Identity Manager option. That was the third radio button in the sync settings screen. What this will do is disable all the sync settings within the Manage UPA. So that's the green icon and the 4 different screens that are underneath it. And what this effectively allows us to do is leverage something external to SharePoint, which is going to do the work. And we had this before in SharePoint 2010, but if you clicked it, you were in an unsupported state. And believe me, there were discussions with them about maybe it'd be a good idea to hide that in the UI by using a hidden tag. But anyway, it never happened. But now it's supported. But this involves purchasing and deploying, or building and deploying external software which will do the sync operations. So there's 2 ways we can look at this, especially from a Microsoft perspective. One is to leverage Forefront Identity Manager, not the one that comes with SharePoint, but the real one, along with a thing that's shipping shortly called the SharePoint Connector, which is a management agent for SharePoint. Or we can use custom code and do all of this outside of SharePoint. For large organizations, this is very attractive, especially if they already have an investment in Forefront Identity Manager, or they're trying to do things that UPS just can't do. The important thing to understand here is that it requires Forefront Identity Manager 2010 R2 SP1 or above. And in fact, the connector ships with a different build of the sync service. And there is also a generic LDAP connector in this downloadable package, or rather there will be when it ships. This allows us to do end-to-end identity management, whether that be full synchronization, whether it be speaking to other systems that UPS doesn't support, or tying into our existing lifecycle tools. So maybe we have a hire process where somebody in HR uses a line of business system to create a user in a database, and then we create the account in Active Directory, we create it in SharePoint, we create it in SAP. Very common scenario. This will be available very shortly. We're just getting finished with the testing for this, testing scenarios. It'll be an external download on msdownloads.com. Support for SharePoint 2013 at the point of release, and then we'll bring on 2010 support a few months afterwards once we've completed the testing on 2010. Obviously, 2013 is very much the priority here. Okay, so to wrap up, this is hugely important. The number of times I've been in a deployment where this hasn't happened, that's the root cause of most problems related to profile synchronization. It sounds obvious, but it's far too uncommon. So especially with profile property mappings, this is a huge deal. Need to choose the right mode. This is just some sort of broad recommendations. AD import's good for small organizations. You don't have these external systems. You don't have the time to manage them anyway, and you just want a fast and simple solution. Get up and running quickly. Then look to UPS if you're slightly larger. You may be using a non-Microsoft identity management tool. You might have multiple forests to deal with, or external systems. And then the external identity manager is really for people who currently use FIM or want to get to that place, want to invest in identity management across many different systems, not just SharePoint. Remember, try and use AD import to get up and running quickly, and then switch to UPS as and when you need its capabilities or you have a business requirement for the other things that it can do. And so with that, thanks very much. Again, apologies for running slightly over time. If you do have any further questions, please tweet face them, and we'll pick them up at the end session later this afternoon. Thanks very much.